Well, yesterday, the Centre for Social Development at the University of Johannesburg launched the 2019 elections Socio-Economic Performance and Voter Preference Study that seeks to understand voter behaviour and why people choose one party over another. Leila Patel is a politics professor. She compiled the study with her colleague, Professor Yolande Sadie, using a sample of 3,431 people in November and December last year. And she joins us now to tell us about the outcomes. The problem with these kinds of studies is that they're a moving target and perceptions can change. Do you think people still feel the same way they did in November and December?
You know, if you're doing an opinion poll, then I think the polls are shifting all the time, the numbers, because you're asking who are you going to vote for. We're asking the question of why you're choosing to vote for X or Y party, and what drives your decision making. And we find, you know, we've done, this is the second survey. Yes. We did the first one end of 2017. So we're comparing also with 27 findings in 2018. And we find that there's a complete shift from our previous findings.
Absolutely, yeah.
Would you like me to share that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this time there are three things that seem to be up, four things actually that's uppermost in the minds of voters as they make their decisions. The first is that the trust in the president seems to be a significant drive of people's choices for the ANC.
So that's verifiable now? That's
now absolutely statistically verifiable. We've modeled it statistically with him as part of a set of indicators on trust in institutions.
Yeah, because everybody has been talking about Ramaphosa.
Exactly.
So you're saying it's a thing, it exists.
Yeah.
Yes.
So between those who would distrust him and those who trust him, there's a tenfold likelihood that they would vote for the ANC.
Oh, wow.
And the change between the Zuma presidency and his presidency, his trust in the presidency of Ramaphosa climbs 29% over the 12-month period.
Yeah.
So that is very significant. Secondly, that previously we didn't find that there was a relationship between party loyalty, the party that brings freedom and democracy for people, and that wasn't significant. This time it is, and we think that trust in him seems to be rekindling support among people who would have shifted their votes to the opposition.
It's an interesting time for perception to be for the ANC when part of your assertion is that people are unhappy with service delivery protests, that indicators are service delivery protests that have gone up, and the allegations of corruption that have kept coming up.
Oh, absolutely. So that is why it's a complicated story. It's not a simple answer that one can find. So with corruption, you find that, and that's also significant. So 72% of all the people in our study in the sample said that they believe that corruption had increased in the past 12 months. Yeah. So what sense do we make of that on the one hand versus the trust in the president? So I think voters are struggling with decision making and making choices between their parties and their reasons.
So you're talking about socio-economic development and linking that to voter preferences. Which socio-economic issues are uppermost, were uppermost in your sample?
So Desiree, there are two things that came up very strongly for all the respondents. They said, 2/3 said that they will choose a party because they believe that party will bring a better life. The majority of our respondents said that their decision is driven by their material well-being, their socio-economic realities. And we see also what is most significant in their voter choices is not whether you get a grant or not, but if you're afraid that you will lose your grant if you voted for for the opposition.
Yeah.
So that is a huge driver of people's choice to vote for the ANC as opposed to an opposition party, and that is more than double.
As academics, what were the interesting outcomes for you that almost went against what you thought going into the process?
Yeah. So what was very significant previously was that women were just over 70% more likely to choose an opposition party. Now, in the last survey. So that was very stark, because historically women have always voted for the ANC over an opposition party since 1994. And we put that down to the Zuma presidency, but also just the social and economic conditions in the country, corruption, and just loss of just public faith and trust in the governing party. But this time, gender is not a factor in voting, in people's choices. So it seems that between the last survey we did and now, that the women are putting their weight again behind the ANC.
And they're given a voice, seemingly. The assertion about service delivery having gone up, we've just seen a story in Alex where there was service delivery protests, and there was this sort of disagreement about the real cause of this protest. Was it authentic? Were people really aggrieved about the non-delivery of services, or was there a political driver in the background? What sort of conversations were you able to pick up about service delivery and the sources of this action?
So that wasn't something that we focused on in the study at all. We asked very specific questions which relates to service delivery as part of your socio-economic well-being and your trust in institutions. Do you trust Parliament now? Trust in SASSA was quite improved since the last survey.
It's interesting you talk about trust in SASSA, because one of the assertions is that people who are a huge chunk of grant beneficiaries or grant recipients are uneasy about moving to other political parties because of the fear that these parties might reverse grants. Tell us about that.
So, well, this particular finding, that's absolutely statistically significant in our data. And it is consistent since we started this research in 2014. So over 3 different types of studies, we find that fear of loss of a grant, if you voted for another party, is a driver of people's choice for the governing party. And what it seems to say is that grant beneficiaries have a policy preference for social grants as a social policy and a program. Secondly, that they also have, they don't trust that another political party would respect their constitutional right to a social grant, which is a right. I mean, our grant system can't be seen to be vote buying, because you've got a constitutional right to it, to a social assistance if you have a need. And obviously political parties, if new ones come to power, they can reorganize and restructure the system, but they would have to meet the constitutional requirement. So I think that's a factor. And then there's legislation that sets up the system independently so that beneficiaries are properly assessed, and that this administration is supposedly perceived to be separate from the political interference.
What is the significance of this study? And also break down the numbers for us in terms of the important ones that indicate trends and where we're going.
So the ones I've already cited are the ones that are most significant. The one other interesting, because corruption is a key driver, concerns about institutions and governance, the leadership of the party. People have concerns about that. But despite that, it seems that there is hope in Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency that a new leadership in the ANC might be able to take the country out of the quagmire. So that could be one of the kind of drivers behind it. The other thing I think is important is to notice that this election, land reform is a big question. And we asked that in the survey. We didn't ask it previously. And that is not a significant driver of voter preference in this election at all. 45% of people said that they supported land restitution with compensation, and 34% said without compensation. So that certainly isn't a driver.
You also looked into governance, which mostly would relate, maybe a bit with state-owned institutions as well, but mostly with private corporates. How was that responded to?
We didn't pose that as an option because there are so many options, Desiree, that you can, you know, crowd the questionnaires too much. So this kind of study has limitations because there are maybe other reasons that are also influencing people's decision making and their choices than the ones we asked. But the 11 factors that we put in our statistical model were all highly significant.
So you didn't leave space for other opinions?
No.
Okay.
I mean, you know, so say if somebody, we didn't ask a question, for example, do you have a dilemma about who to vote for? Are you worried about corruption, but you're now voting for the ANC? What's your choice? We didn't ask something like that.
Again, I want to ask, what is the significance of the study?
The significance is that it tells us why people are voting the way they do. If you look at a poll, you just get the numbers. This is what's the decision making? What do people actually think? It's not, and they're very conscious about the decisions they make.
It's a big decision.
And they are treating it, the data tells us that some of the findings are a little bit contradictory. So we say it's unexpected. If you are worried about corruption, then why would you support the ruling party, the governing party?
It's the big question right now. So,
but people are making choices and decisions around that. And I think what we see here is that voters are active decision makers. They base it on what they perceive is in their best interests and for, you know, their well-being.
So when all is said and done, how are the South African voters going to be voting?
I don't want to speculate about that. I think the polls are, based on the research, it looks like the ANC will win comfortably. You know, we found it was only 56% then. Support for the president was 55%. So other polls are now putting it at 61%.
Okay. Where can our viewers get hold of the study?
They can get it on our website. It's at www.uj.ac.za/CSDA.
Professor Leila Patel, politics professor with the University of Johannesburg.
No, I'm actually a professor of social development studies.
Is that so? Thank you so much for coming through and talking to us about this important piece of study.
Thank you, Desiree.
And you're watching The Agenda.